Hello everyone, today we talk about the Constantinian Senatorial order. Just the other day we were talking about late antiquity as a period of change, so this is definitely one of those elements that on that occasion we haven't really looked in detail, that however explain in part this passage. You know what we're talking about. The context is fundamentally this early 4th century where into which Constantine, as a Roman emperor, fundamentally shifts the center of power of the empire, at least one of the major center of power of the empire, on the east, on the Bosphorus, as a matter of fact, rebuilding the city, the ancient city of Byzantium, and naming it Constantinople, and fundamentally trying to emulate Rome in its basically in everything, not just as a new capital of the empire. This time actually were already other cities that, albeit not capitals, had risen to a consistent power, more or a consistent political and strategical significance than Rome. We remember Trier, Milan, Naissus, Nicomedia. Well, Constantinople was something new, definitely. It was it was being conceived as another Rome, fundamentally, and a copy of it. Naturally, much has been said about this shift towards the east. Much has been also overly emphasized, because objectively, even especially in this first phase, definitely Constantinople's foundation was very important, but it didn't quite change much the balance initially. I mean, the great shift towards this is something that took time progressively during the 4th century. I even made a video on that, which is about actually a century afterwards, in fact, which is Theodosius and the choice of the East. So if you're interested in that, but we will definitely come back on this greater choice, let's say. But Rome, in this sense, was emulated chiefly for the you can argue the most important institution of the empire, that was the Senate. So the Senate had this vital importance in Roman politics since the very beginning. Was the assembly, theoretically, of the elders, of the fathers, let's say, that had this primacy. You know that Rome had always maintained an oligarchic profile, even in the moments when it kind of resembled more a kind of a democratic institution. Rome was always, at all times, an oligarchy. Constantine's choice has to be understood naturally also in function of the senatorial interference in the matters of the emperors. Constantine, as you know, came at the end of a series of emperors that fundamentally restored the empire, its unity. The empire could realistically collapse in the 3rd century. And one of the problems that had characterized this moment of disorder, of disgregation, had been also the internal conflict existing between the Senate and the emperors, meant also as emperor soldiers and so on. Now, it's very complicated to retell that story now, and we're not going to do it. But you know what the essentials fundamentally were. With the general economical crisis that fundamentally hit not just the empire but mostly all Eurasia from a certain point of view in this moment, there had been all the imaginable consequences, including the migration of peoples, etc., the militarization of the frontiers, the recruitment problems that now Rome, after centuries, was exposed to. So, and once again, and what we talk about generally, in fact, is the 3rd century crisis. Well, this crisis was very internal in many ways. Actually, during the 3rd century, there hadn't been actually very massive enemy offensives on Rome. I mean, that there were definitely very important and threatening offenses when it came to especially the East. There is the Palmyrene revolt. There is also during the 3rd century the strengthening of the Persian Empire and the Sasanian dynasty. But fundamentally, the main problem had been internal and political, and especially in the West, that was still at the time the very center of the empire. But throughout all the 3rd century, you can argue that Italy was still kind of if not the real center, what in fact the majority of emperors had aimed to in order to have their safe center of power. And that was the problem, because in Italy there was Rome and there was the Senate. And the Senate represented that class of extremely powerful and wealthy land holders that in fact had entire provinces under their control. You know that Rome had this split between the imperial provinces and the senatorial provinces. So that represented in many ways the most conservative and reactionary force that had been struggling consistently over the years to mitigate the power of emperors, actually not managing it, because emperors had reached a kind of a greater power. But still in the 3rd century, the Roman Senate was an effective thing. I mean, think about the rebellion of Maximin and Trajan, all the various resistance that the senators could put up. So the problem of the Senate, it was very influent, and it tended fundamentally to stem the imperial policies that frankly were not so tyrannic as they were claiming to be, because fundamentally what the emperors were mostly interested in at that point was having this larger freedom of movement in many ways, and this entailed the necessity of fluidifying the economy. The senatorial luxus instead went exactly the other way, because the senators wanted fundamentally to maintain economy relatively stagnating. I mean, based on the latifundia and having this heavy golden currency that could still be in favor, that fundamentally benefited their own luxury trade, etc. During the 3rd century, in a way, the imperial policies that had been set during the 2nd century had the 1st and 2nd century that had favored instead the denarius, the currency that favored the middle class, fundamentally had failed, because the middle class now during the 3rd century crisis had gone. And even though definitely the empire was huge, so there are wild differences between the various areas, but this generally was the trend. So now the problem for Constantine, making it very approximately as an historical assessment, but we don't have much time, was not just, in fact, okay, let's take note of the fact that all these policies have failed. So we have necessary to back this time a gold currency, like the solidus, in fact, that is fundamentally functional to a certain type of society, like the one of the early 4th century had translated itself into. You know that the last, at least this is said, but we're not 100% sure, but it was Diocletian. I made a video on him in this sense of the administrative reforms, etc. That is attempted, let's say, to revive the denarius, the silver coin, this end of the 3rd century, hoping that there could be a middle class revival, kind of a old style Augustan equilibrium. But seemingly the structure at this point the system had completely collapsed, and Constantine is credited to have understood, among the many other things that were changing, including the spread of Christianity, this increasing importance on the frontiers, and of the East as the wealthiest and also more strategically sound area of the empire, that a change had to be made. And the problem was, though, still Rome. In fact, at this point the idea was not just going against the Senate, because Constantine was quite, quite reverent towards the Senate. I mean, that there is all this debate about whether Constantine was actually pro-paganism or pro-Christianity. If you look at his policy, fundamentally he did what he had to do with both sides in order to maintain a balance. As many great leaders of the time, he was, at the eyes of the Christians, of course, he was a Christian, as a matter of fact. At the eyes of the senatorial pagan elites, that are also the side that fundamentally we know less about, but because eventually Christianity took over and also kind of silenced that perspective, historiographically speaking, he was still pretty much reverent. There have been very significant changes also in here. Constantine was revering the Senate because that was what a Roman emperor would do, but not that he was directly so much loving of the Senate. So what he does is not to dismiss the Senate, of course, but he decides to found another Senate in Constantinople that had to be fundamentally a copy of the one of Rome, albeit what was the deal here now is that what was the Senate? Originally, definitely was not a duplication of the Roman Senate. It was naturally an assembly that had this, personally don't even know the details now, but it originated just as Constantinople in itself, as a sort of entourage and a court of the supporters of Constantine. Remember that, we talk about Senate, the Roman Senate, as the most important political body of the empire. But the Roman Empire, even before Constantine, etc., and the great change, was full of local councils, of assemblies, because fundamentally the empire ruled over communities. I mean, there was not the concept that the Senate was just also in here it's difficult because bureaucracy is also enhanced, so definitely also from this time onwards there is the idea that there is a stronger state, I mean administratively, bureaucratically speaking, and the Senate, originally speaking, was a kind of a tribal thing. I mean, it stemmed really from the the ancient Roman warriors, the privileged, the founding fathers, if you want. It was something very also mystical that had defined Roman politics. It was all one thing with religion. That's why also religion, where I hope that there is still no one out there that believes that the Roman Empire was a lay empire in any way, of course, nor under pagan times, but nor under Christian times. But at the end of the day, this Senate grew, however, progressively, as you know, with the importance of Constantinople, from this kind of local assembly into something more consistent. Obviously, Constantine gave immediately a great importance to the Constantinopolitan Senate, and you can trace this trend all over Byzantine history, if you want to call it in this way, because Constantinople formally originated as a secondary thing. I mean, it never could fully claim the primacy of Rome. I mean, at a certain point they did, but they were perfectly aware that Constantinople was not Rome. It was something created later that had, in many ways, at least a very ambiguous legitimacy. Of course, Constantine was the emperor, so the emperor could do certain things, but that's the point. Theoretically, the emperor was just the magistrate who had the imperium. As a matter of fact, this was conferred by the Senate. It was something conferred by God in turn. So here you understand many, and by the gods initially, of course. But this was now all pretty mixed up. What really mattered was who had the army under his command, who could control the empire effectively, and that's what Constantine has been. As we were saying before, we will have to talk a lot about Constantine. It's a very, you can say, definitely overlooked figure, because there is a lot about Constantine out there, but it's like all great figures, he's been, let's say, misused. I would say. Yeah, I know it's a bad term, but it is in fact. That you look at him and you just judge what he had to be accordingly. We know almost nothing about Constantine, first of all, as a person. Also, the historiography of the time is pretty vague. It's already pretty much dichotomic, unidirectional. I mean, the idea is that at this point, historiography starts becoming, not that Roman historiography had ever been kind of a free thinking one. There is nothing like free thinking in the ancient world, especially at the political level. But is misused because, well, of all the reasons you can imagine. I mean, I'm sure out there, but even among you, there is who thinks that Constantine ruined everything, that it was a massive problem. No, it doesn't really work like that. And also, the historiography of the time doesn't help because it's written as propaganda, or pro or against, and there is no much way to understand the figure of, to comprehend actually the figure of a person who really objectively changed world history forever, had a massive influence also on the later historiography, because he was the first historiographers of the time, chiefly the Christians, as you can imagine, that kind of transmutated his figure into something that probably from an historical point of view was not, but this was normal at the time, whichever historiographer would have done the same. But the relevant historical datum at this point is, in fact, the change into this process, not really what the historical figure was, because we have unfortunately to renounce to know that, but really how it was portrayed. And therefore from there we can understand much about that society, how thinking was changing. Part of this change was definitely due actively to Constantine and his policy in itself. So as we have said, the senatorial order at this time remained even after Constantine duplication, let's say, in the civil system, in the civil organization of the empire. The connection between the hierarchy of the social classes and the political organization. How? Well, fundamentally, the senatorial order was made up of elements that, even before Constantine, as you can imagine, had this direct control of the imperial affairs, as we were recalling before, with these large estates that were and were actually becoming even more vital for the control of the empire. Remember, the economical crisis we were talking before was seeing, or at this time, a relative contraction of certain transactions. I mean, of certain activities in middle classes, etc. So this was a phase in which the assets were coming prepotently back on the land. So land estates at this time were really the base of economy, and the whole imperial. I mean, they had always been, of course, but we are in the late empire, things that are transforming. Cities are kind of declining. Trade is contracting. This is not really true in Constantinian times in itself, but you know that it is a trend, a general trend. If you really look at it, a broader range of this kind of late empire, this is the direction that is followed. And consistently at this time, the middle classes are not faring that well. So that transformation, in many ways, as we've seen with Constantine himself, was a necessity, and Constantine was just enhancing it. So by duplicating a Senate also in the East that could have the same kind of grip on the imperial affairs from that part. So the descendants of the senatorial families usually entered in the civil careers pretty easily. I mean, this is a very evident datum. And at the same time, the bureaucrats were chosen by the emperor outside the senatorial class, fundamentally the senators and the senatorial families, basically ended up to enter by right into the senatorial order. This usually having obtained certain offices of high rank in the imperial administration, that therefore could equate them to the senator, and they to the other senators in entering effectively in the Senate themselves. So this was a very important development, because usually, and this is a characteristic of the eastern half of the empire in many ways, is that there was a more meritocratic mindset than in the West. I mean, in the West, for many reasons actually, that are kind of definitely veiled, let's say, at least in depending on actually the various parts of the empire, because there were, I have to explain it better. Let's say that before becoming, this is the crucial point, is that usually before becoming a senator during the Principate, you had usually to pass through the equestrian order. It was this kind of middle ground. There were several careers in public administration that could be followed by the populace, then by the knights, and then by the aristocrats and the noblemen. So it was the Roman Empire actually in its very origin was meritocratic in many ways, but at the same time it had remained kind of a matter of aristocracies. I mean, it was meritocratic in the sense that if you were an aristocrat, especially in an expansive phase, like if you were a foreign aristocrat that had a certain control over his society, his community, etc., and you entered into the orbit of the empire, you could aspire to become a Roman citizen and therefore belong to the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate at this time hosted consistent number of non-Italians, for instance. That was normal, reflected the situation at the time. What is interesting, by the way, is that in fact this double Senate is reflected also in the component of the components of the empire. I mean, obviously, the Senate of Rome remained more. It usually were the Italics and the Gauls that the Gallo-Romans that kind of dominated into the Roman Senate, because those were the areas that were kind of more important at the time. Also, strategically speaking, now. It's complicated to address the whole issue, but I'd say that in the East, what is introduced is this possibility to become a senator without having passed through the old line. I mean, you could actually rise very quickly to a certain office, and because of that, which usually happened, if it did, because probably you were kind of at least a favorite of the emperor in some way, you could enter into the senatorial order. Naturally, the imperial entourage was preferably made up of capable people, and when you build an empire from scratch, like Constantine did in institutional terms in the East, it's obvious that you can make you have this tabula rasa, originally speaking. You don't have all this pre-existing local aristocracy that with their own prerogatives and values and ideas and resistance and conservatism. You can appoint whoever you want. So the Constantinopolitan Senate is born with this stigma of people that fundamentally were put there actually also favorable because of ability of some certain other relations that they had with the emperor, his entourage, and so on. And in a way, therefore, in the East was more directly plasmated to serve the emperor in many ways. Whereas in the West, this had been always kind of the Senate looking at what the emperor was doing in a sinister way and kind of saying, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? We don't like that. It's not in the customs. It's not in our traditions, etc. So actively hampering his work, his policy. So this is what fundamentally also the West remains. This is particularly important because you realize that also in the West at a certain point the capital was shifted. Rome actually maintained always this kind of till the very end. Actually, the title of capital. Nobody actually overstepped Rome in being the center of the empire, but you see that the administrative center of the empire at that point was, as well with the Senate, was with a part of the Senate, or better, the Roman Senate remained in Rome, but when the imperial seat was shifted to Ravenna, for instance, well, there was a council even there, of course, that functioned in many ways, and this was perfectly normal, because the Roman Senate was something very ancient, very structured. It had its rules, its etc., its traditions. But a council is what kind of every power has. I mean, at this time, there is no power out there that doesn't work with some kind of assembly. So it was normal for an emperor to have his own comitatus. Even just think about the Constantine does something. He also disbanded the Praetorians. Apparently, he created this other Palatine guards that had. So you realize in that case was done mostly to keep the Senate in Rome kind of freer and more complacent in many ways. But he basically built the same thing in Rome, in Constantinople for himself. But this skipping the equestrian level of career was particularly important because this brought in more people that definitely came from there. In fact, in the West properly, if you look at the aristocracy, that was for, because you understand that electing someone directly to the seniority of the Senate equated to create effectively a new aristocracy in that fashion. I mean, whoever entered the Senate at that point was consistently a new person in the system. There was also rewarded in some way, that owned some power. There was a segmentation, that is what we are going to see now, but that still made it kind of something cohesive, so politically speaking. And in the West, the general perception, which was actually right, is that generally speaking, the Constantinopolitan Senate and administration was made up of non-noblemen, or at least of people who were kind of parvenus in some cases, and didn't quite have the same dignity, the same couldn't arrive to the primacy of Rome in terms of chief of the head of the empire, etc. And this is reflected at different levels. For instance, even in education. I mean, the Byzantines during the following centuries basically created a very efficient system of education that was a melange, fundamentally, of Latin and Greek culture. So that if you wanted to be a bureaucrat, an administrator, you had to know something like, I don't know, the Odyssey or Virgil. I mean, there was the idea that the personnel had to be educated, had to be trained, had to be selected in many ways. There was corruption, like at this time, every single political entity in the world was heavily corrupted in many ways. There was no sense of what we have today. We are corrupted not as much as that, but at that time it was also, even corruption was a mean of making things work. Just the other day I made that video on contractors, money and scams in early modern Europe, that obviously is kind of more than 1 millennium afterwards now, but then Constantine. But just for making you understand that how those systems really worked. The situation in the West was way less flexible, because the families who made up the Senate effectively governed the whole, depending on the centuries, vast areas of what was in fact the western half of the empire. and they were in fact of very ancient nobility, and they were extremely proud of that. They were in fact also the most resisting ones to Christianization for up to a certain time. They were more educated. Let's be honest. This is dramatically evident even from studies like paleography, etc. When, especially at the end of like in the 6th century, where there was the Gothic War, etc., there was a lot of Italic senators that fled to Constantinople, and they brought with them lots of manuscripts and of knowledge, etc., that was lacking now in the East, because in the East that was being molded in a completely different way, on very different basis. I mean, they were still fabricating what would remain, in fact, as the pride of the Romans in the East. This idea that the Byzantines were effectively the same Romans that held not just the legitimacy of the empire, but also its cultural legacy, etc. But in many ways, that was a kind of a new product, something that had been forming in mindset, etc. from from Constantine itself, because Constantine at this point was also building over the kind of the Hellenistic, but non strictly Hellenic culture that was prevalent in the East. But in this sense, it owed more to other components that were not strictly the original one, the Latin ones of the empire, for instance, the Latin Italic ones, or the ones that had, however, remained, because there was a transformation also of the West during the centuries in the West. Also in terms of political balance, that the Byzantine emperor in fact becomes a sort of sole autocratic ruler, an absolute ruler that, in the West, this would have been much more complicated. I mean, it went close to that in some ways, because definitely also in there, since the very first centuries of the Principate, you can see the progression of how the ideal of the emperor just as a first among equal, like a normal citizen, almost a normal citizen, like all the others, was, supplanted by the increasing Hellenistic model with things like the proskunesis, the thing that had been in fact started to happen exactly because of that social transformation we were telling you before, the decline of the middle class, of this kind of democratic character that Rome had in some part, in spite of the oligarchic prevalence all over the Roman history. But just for saying that East and West were very different in many ways, and that when you look at the empire, you can't even just say, well, this is a change that has been started by someone, because before it wasn't like that. Well, this was ongoing from centuries in the respective cultures, in this kind of Latin East and Hellenic East, Latin West and Hellenic East, more or less, that had been consistently different. That's the comparison I always make with Augustus, when, in the West, he was presenting himself to the Romans, to the Roman Senate. He stressed the thing of being just a Roman citizen, first among equals, that the gods had spoken, kind of had talked to him and had acted through him and all this stuff, but still being a Roman citizen that would be fundamentally an Italic warrior mindset, where everybody was equal in the perfect Indo-European fashion. In the East, he could go to Egypt and present himself just like the, not at all new king or emperor or pharaoh, in fact, in that specific context, and appearing like a semi-divine ruler. And that's why also Constantinian choice was so clever, because he understood that the East, in many ways, had this millenary, let's say, monarchical and bureaucratical traditions. It was the richest area, so he could also, by going there, immediately also presenting himself as a kind of a more powerful ruler that could mold his own government in a much more autocratic fashion. we're talking obviously about relative terms, because it's not that even the East was just, a bunch of places where all the people were kind of slaves kneeling in front of the great empire. It wasn't nothing like that. Actually, the same Hellenic tradition was pretty much kind of, imbued with democratic ideals, etc. But at this point, it was more of a kind of an Hellenistic world, where, in fact, also for social reasons, had transformed into a place where fundamentally was the emperor of the situation that just ruled and was set there to rule. It's no surprise that the Byzantine court rituals and images of the emperor and etc. were since this very early Byzantine years massively influenced by the Persian imperial models that were, as ancient as the Achaemenid Empire, and that were, in fact, had a great influence. It was also the other way around in some ways. Also, the Persians were influenced by the Christian Empire, the Christian monarchy of the Roman Empire consistently, and also obviously what came before was known about it from previous to pre-Christian times. But this is important because it's a game that in the West could have not been acceptable. The West was still very much more tribal in mindset in many ways. It was more. Surely you can't say that there hadn't been changes, but it was more conservative in this sense, and it was the senatorial class that was the most conservative in this direction. But the West was very different, and there would be a lot to add also relatively to the various the various reactions to the so-called barbarization that, as you know, if you have followed Schwerpunkt for some year, quite critical of, but generally speaking, you see it even in the West, is that the West had a much weaker and less effective reaction to Germanization in many ways. But you can spot in there that this existed mostly where there was this greater continuity with, let's say, the Mediterranean Hellenistic models, and where instead there was a kind of a still superficially Romanized area that could be also very close to Rome geographically. There was a greater acceptance of the German model that, by the way, was definitely a very different one, because it was paradoxically more genuine for most of the inhabitants of the Western Roman Empire, that were, historically tribesmen, as in kind of sense of equality and in mindset, and that weren't definitely happy of the social transformations that had gone on in the last centuries, where the senators had been taking over literally everything and transforming the free landowners into colonists, that is basically into serfs. Doesn't matter whether they were juridically freemen. At that point, things had started to change a lot, but this is another chapter. An important part of this is that Constantine in the East could now form a Senate on his own that could balance the several elements. Noblemen that at this point had grown into the Constantinopolitan Senate also as the, let's say, as the ruling class, that, however, could still absorb and integrate other elements coming from the bureaucracy, coming from other ways that the emperor decided, etc. This was very clever, because we will see now that the ways in which it was done were very gradated, we can say. I don't know, excuse me, I don't find the right term. Gradate. I believe it's the correct term in English. So, in fact, there was a stratification of the senatorial order that had already started to take place before. In this sense, Constantine didn't invent quite anything particularly new. As one of the great political geniuses in history, he just mostly was able to combine things that already existed in a way that in an original synthesis that kind of had not been understood before. For instance, what it concerns the hereditarity, already since late Republican times, or even before actually, the senatorial order was de facto hereditary. With the Principate, it even had become it by law hereditary, because the sons of the senators had the duty to present themselves at the magistracies. So the senatorial order comprehended both the senators and their own agnatic descendants up to the third grade in line. This is very important in the genealogy, and in all its members and even to their women spectated the title of clarissimus. Clarissimus would be most famous, famed and for good, of course. Since also these precedent times, the senators were exempted by municipal services. That fundamentally, by some of them at least, but the heaviest ones, that this nobility in the empire was fundamentally was invested most of the times, and this is the typical of ergotism, and something that also existed in Hellenism, that fundamentally they were they had some charges that they used to effectively rule the local municipalities, the local cities, etc., which meant that basically they obtained this role, which was actually a very hard one, a very committing one, for which they had to pay for everything, like for the games, for the upkeeping, the maintenance of aqueducts, of roads, for even some part of the military, the local militia, etc. So some of the senators, especially the kind of and this is where corruption also entered in, were kind of exempted by certain these duties, but nevertheless this is how still society worked. So that the empire didn't actually spend much on administration, because it was the same senators that had with their assets the interest to invest into certain the public activities. And that's also why during the late Roman Empire, with the economical contractions and the invasions, etc., the cities became less important strategical assets from an economical point of view, because they were more exposed, because they were declining. So that's why also a lot of investment now started occurring more into what had been the private assets, that is the land, the estates, etc. So these lands, by the way, and that's how also the emperor fundamentally worked in many ways, because the imperial fiscus was effectively this. It was an amount of land that was public in theory, but it basically was the emperor purse for all expenses, because that was public land that the emperors could and tax exemptions sometimes were in fact occurred even in the imperial lands. And it was particularly interesting. I made that video on the recruitment. Wait, if I give you the title, late Roman recruitment. Let me see. Fiscal recruitment in late Roman army, 4th, 5th century. That's a video I made on it. It can be interesting. It talks essentially also about this, and it shows you how there were so many exemptions depending on who held the land, and how also money was cash. It was a much less homogeneous way that you can imagine. Everything was much more pragmatic and based on this political relations more than an actual homogeneous system where everything kind of worked for everyone in the same way, like we tend to imagine the Roman army, the Roman Empire, etc. At this time, everything gravitated around the fiscus, in fact, because there had to be an active recruitment of troops, of resources, because of economical contraction, of the scarcity of currency. It was a problem, in fact, because that's why the Constantinian reforms had been enforced at this point, that favoring the solidus, favoring the heavy golden coin, because that's also how how precious stones were coming back to become the favorite asset in many ways. Also, this senatorial order that was the only one that could afford to have such this currency that also reflected their luxury production most of the times. But it was at this point kind of expanding literally everywhere. So you understand it's very, very intertwined in many ways, but the talking about the stratification of the Senate, how were the various levels? Well, there were these three bureaucratic classes in that fundamentally reflected the distribution of the high functionaries of the empire. So that joined the Senate. So the first one were the viri clarissimi that we saw before. So vir means theoretically men, but not just men in homo is man in Latin, but it's vir is the virtuous man. That's where from virtue comes. And vir is actually, it's very difficult to explain its etymology. I tried to do it in that video on the Indo-European sacred fury, that in fact where the virtus actually expresses that is actually the sum of all the Roman virtues, and it's this kind of state of perfection of ethical perfection for which you receive the moral, the gift of the deity of the sky, and therefore this was also all intertwined with religious concepts. So viri is simply the plural, and clarissimi is the adjective that simply means most famous, more as kind of famed. Then the viri spectabiles, so this respected and praised and even prized kind of individuals. And then the viri illustres, so the illustrious men. And this distribution was in fact occurring in both the Roman and the Constantinopolitan Senate, and this reflected perfectly the grade that was reached by the senators in the offices of the empire. And as we said before, there is this thing never to be forgotten, that this every by the title of clarissimus, so the lowest one, was due by inheritance to all the members of the senatorial order. And we're talking about several thousands of people. So this wasn't just a few privileged. This was effectively a whole body of aristocrats that you can't call them, because they were effectively the best, the cream of society, and that in this sense was given, as the title of clarissimus to them even before they actually entered the Senate, and even if they actually didn't participate to the bureaucratic careers. So once you had in the family close relative that was a clarissimus, this you acquired the same title because you were part of that senatorial order at that point. So this was very important because naturally it was a glue to keep all this net together, so that it's not just about the competition of one person against the other. It's also certain families that have some further union, have certain needs to fundamentally to stick together and increase definitely the competition within, of course, the same groups, but at the same time to stick to that profession in many ways, and all that this entailed in political terms. So to say fundamentally also within the system that at this time was not to be given for granted, because we're in the 4th century, but in the 3rd century you have seen that there were consistent problems in even determining who was who within the same Roman world. I mean, think about all the rebels, even those. Think about Tetricus, that was the kind of the emperor of the Gauls. I mean, what was the system there? This new senatorial system was granting instead a reason more to participate to the empire. So it was kind of extending it was kind of making become the senatorial title more dependent. I mean, surely more profitable, especially for those who in fact were not senators, especially those who came for the bureaucratic, from bureaucracy. It was increasing and developing a lot at this time. So even bureaucracy was enlarging. There were more people who were competing. This also made some of the most effective elements join the Senate and serving the emperor in this sense. But this means that it wasn't just, I mean, it was becoming hereditary as well, but it wasn't the same hereditary that had identified the old Latin, let's say Latin Roman Senate, because that one was so old, so stratified, that there was something that even went beyond the participation to the public, to say the imperial politics. It was a matter of being, okay, we are the senators, we can do whatever we want. At this time, we said with this system, you could have, from one side, these senators were kind of starting also being jealous in turn of their prerogatives, etc., but still new components that could be poured in, and therefore making this a kind of a fluid system where you could kind of balance out things more easily. The thing of balancing all the elements is very important. Sometimes when we look at these worlds, we say, oh well, but wouldn't been better to rule with iron fist everything, like without these favoritisms? No, because at that time there weren't enough coercive means to rule with iron fist. And creating a competition, creating a balance where you keep people hungry and kind of fearful of each other is a very good way to control them with your favor. And this is how really politics, all politics between, say, until the creation of the nation state, where there is really an iron fist ruling over the country, the only and the most profitable way actually to rule, because this was definitely not a stable moment. You realize, if you know Byzantine history, even from the 4th century, it's all but a stable system at all. But at the same time, if you look at it in historical perspective, you realize that in spite of all the problems that existed, even of political nature, emperors overthrown or assassinated, all these things, there was still a body, an institutional body that survived, and that was able to redirect from the Bosphorus all these to control and direct all these resources of the eastern half of the empire that effectively were to survive, and were to survive even against very, very hard odds, with dangerous peoples attacking Constantinople, creating problems. Even internally, there were definitely very great problems. There was the problem at a certain point also of the Germanic element. Not much in terms of troops, but rather in terms of political leaders, because at this point there had been also the problem of balancing out the military class with the senatorial one, because the military one was definitely constantly involved into this control of the military resources, definitely, but also in fact of the political balance, because whoever controlled the army could have very clear ambitions. So the emperors didn't control at all times everything. Even in that in Eastern Roman history, sometimes there were usurpers that, think about the time of Theodosius, when the empire was kind of reunified, but it was still effectively ruled from Constantinople. Now there were usurpers in the west, and there was war in there, so the control was kind of still precarious. But nevertheless, the Eastern Roman Empire made it through the centuries, also partly to this solidity of the system that was created now. That evenly in the West instead, the West in part, as we've seen, was adopting part of these innovations, or at least a reorganization of the senatorial institution. But it was radically different in political and socio-economical, military terms, and things in fact went kind of in a different way. So as you can imagine, between this supreme, socially supreme senatorial order and the high bureaucracy, there was never a full identification, because even in the Constantinopolitan Senate, there were in fact the true noblemen in many ways, or however over the centuries that there came to be. As you know, today we are talking chiefly about still not later than the 5th century. So it's still kind of a close times. Then of course Byzantine history is consistently made in the following centuries by this private noble families of Constantinople, who basically ruled the whole empire as a private asset, but that's kind of another story. Here still the thing is kind of balanced. So from the other side you had the high bureaucracy. So the two things never quite perfectly matched. We have seen that there were there were senators that were part of the bureaucracy. Some of the bureaucrats that in fact had become senators thanks to their offices in bureaucracy, but they were never quite the same thing. I mean, being a bureaucrat didn't mean to be a senator necessarily. There was still this kind of gap in the middle. That from full identification, overlapping. They were not overlapping. This is the right term. But still, there was a kind of intimate symbiosis into this, because the interests of the bureaucracy in many ways were all the interests of the privates. This is particularly evident. Just thinking about corruption, those things about the fiscus we were talking about before, everything was balanced now in terms of clienteles, of political and social relations. The empire was also consistently divided, in the sense that even within these main partitions of the empire, or even when the empire was unified, there were several different environments, different provinces, and with different worlds. So the senatorial estates were scattered physically somewhere. So there were naturally certain areas of the empire that had certain interests, some others The bureaucracy in this sense was a kind of a unifying, supervising factor that had to intervene or either on one or the other, but also bureaucracy was responding to the emperor, and through them the emperor could kind of change, make favoritisms and so on. So at the end of the day, this system kind of worked together in all things, and that's where also most of the internal political game was really all about. There wasn't just that; it was still also the army, as we've seen. There was the people. These big metropolis of the East were consistently still uncontrollable. You may think that the empire was in control of the cities. No, it wasn't really. It was extremely difficult to control the mob of Constantinople. If you wanted to rule over cities like Constantinople, like Alexandria, like Jerusalem, like Antioch, even Rome, you had to have the people from your side. The emperors sometimes were overthrown or risked pretty often to be overthrown also by popular movements, etc. So it was a very complicated scenario where creating a common body that could keep kind of all together was very useful. And this was naturally possible because of also the pre-Constantinian social spectrum that existed in the East. In the West, it paradoxically, in fact, the older senatorial model kind of functioned better in some ways, in spite of the adaptations that we have seen also occurring in this time there. But it was a necessity in many ways, and it was influenced partly but also by the same ancient Latin Italic model. I mean, the same Senate was de facto a copy of the Roman one, ideally. And so you can imagine all the ties that first of all, the imperial government could rely now on a powerful and strictly solidal class. This class was very strong, very cohesive within itself, because of this usual net of relations and friendships, as you can imagine. Think about the clarissimi that were in fact obtaining this title, this name, just from being part of a senatorial family. That was a big prestige at the time, especially at a time where the majority of there was an increasing gap between the elite and the rest of the people, the masses of the people. Now, being part of that group was something extremely exclusive. There weren't so many other competitors out there. And therefore, this was being sanctioned by the Senate. It's like a club, right? You're part of the club, and it's the club that decides whether to make you enter or not. So there are duties and shares and gifts. It's like that. And a general benefit that should derive from being fundamentally a corporative body that works like that directs, in fact, all these major resources of the empire that can also draw heavily from with corruption and etc. But this was normal. It was a normal characteristic of the governments of the time. And we're talking about definitely the major landowners, those who effectively, in fact, now owned all these armies of colonists and of slaves that didn't depend on the imperial fiscus, and therefore now these people owned the major productive systems in the empire, system of the empire. Owning a latifundium now meant to own, thousands of workers that work with you every day, continuously, without any hope to find anywhere better. I mean, the progressive enserfment, I don't know whether it exists in English as a word, but that was something that sometimes actually very often happened voluntarily. Well, I mean, it was the same freeman citizens that, by name, Roman citizens, but now that they were growing poorer because of the general crisis, the economy went down, trade contracted, barbarian invasions, stuff like that. They prefer to go live and work under one of these centers in the latifundia, in the estates. And okay, it was a pretty bad life, but it still was a life. You weren't dead somewhere out there, so you felt protected. There were all these clienteles, and it was all very progressive. It didn't pass. It didn't change from one day to another. It was something that consistently Roman society had always been, since always. I mean, since the later Republic, you see this enormous estates of centers with the Roman citizenry that had consistently declined, but there was still kind of a middle class that worked at the time. So now this was vanishing as well. So you have these huge masses of impoverished people and justice centers that effectively manage them and direct them and make them work for them, and that's how it really was. And this aristocracy was very cohesive also for certain cultural reasons. I mean, they usually have a common education, as we have seen, also a common lifestyle. And it was, we have stressed before the differences between the East and the West, but effectively this senatorial lifestyle now was pretty much shared by all the elites of the empire. There was a multi-ethnic empire, especially in the East, and it was definitely based on this idea, being what did being a senator meant? Well, all the privileges that we have listed, but being also part of being the ruling class of the greatest empire known in there at the time. Yeah, of course, it was China as well, but that was pretty far away for them. They thought they had a divine mission in some way. The Romans were kind of fixed on this. They truly believed it, and that's why also the competition between East and West was based on things like, but we from Rome we were really the ones who did it, and Constantinople was stressing. What is interesting is here is the conversion. In fact, paganism remained much more, even in strictly educational terms, much more alive in the West. I mean, even in the West, the senators got Christianized at a point because it was profitable, because it was a way also to expand into the ecclesiastical elites, and assets now were becoming pretty powerful. But in this sense, in the Western world, there was a much stronger, as you can imagine, Latin legacy of the ancient, the true kind of ancient Roman tradition. The East now was insisting much more naturally on Christianity, as even though Constantinople was not like he even became the major metropolis of the empire, that there was no martyr being martyrized in Byzantium. So Constantine made the relics of several saints actually being transported there, the same apostles, if I'm not wrong, all the apostles, and the same Constantine was buried there in the middle. But it felt this kind of inferiority complex, because Rome, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, they all had this kind of very important Christian past. Rome, first of all, for being the martyr, the seat of St. Peter's and St. Paul's martyrdom. The others, such as St. Mark in Alexandria, etc., all these. But Constantinople insisted, paradoxically, on this more pious behavior. This is something you find on this orthodoxy. Effectively, Rome was... There are many paradoxes into this, but you realize that Christendom was a much deeper constitutive character of the Byzantine world than it was kind of in the West. If anything, by a matter of education, also in many ways. So I'm not saying that the West was not Christian at this point, meaning that the empire was not Christian. On the contrary, in fact, the Byzantines were eventually going to be, in the early medieval times, way more wavering in terms of strict orthodoxy, because they consistently backed several times heresies to save the unity of the empire. So you see here the same balance that you can find everywhere, while it's in the West that orthodoxy up to the 11th century fundamentally, it maybe lacked some intellectual means, instruments. There is also the filioque problem and this stuff, but in front of the heresies, it was the popes of Rome that say, what the hell are you doing there in Constantinople? But it also insisted, let's shift away from the religious side, because it's kind of not the best example. It can be misleading, but from a strictly educational point of view, the Byzantine education, well, the West had this kind of very strong, deep, Latin education, and there was also very much more respectuous of the pagan past. In relation, the Byzantine world was definitely highly educated on average in the bureaucracy. And this new class that was to make up also the senatorial one, but it had kind of created a sort of concentrated synthesis used in education. There was a synthesis of bit of the classical Greece, of classical Rome, this Christian education, and melt and blend it all in one, like saying, okay, that's the standard, and was kind of it was actually very useful for the purposes that we have traced now, but at the same time was seen with not great admiration from the Western senators that were consistently more. They had a greater tradition, a greater traditional education, and in this sense also a much greater sense of their honos, of their status, they were aware of the legacy they owned as descendants of the true Senate of Rome. So this is interesting because you realize also on the distance how this worked. It's not that nobody cared about this, but the respective senates. The Constantinopolitan Senate saw definitely the empire as one, but they also sensed the distance from the West, and they didn't very much care. And this had been always the Hellenic/Hellenistic mindset in many ways. Even when the Romans conquered places like Greece, etc., the local populations, especially the Hellenic ones, didn't quite, especially the Greeks, actually, they didn't accept, they didn't acknowledge. That's the point. It's not a matter of accepting. They didn't acknowledge the fact that they had been conquered. They thought that culturally they were kind of superior, intellectually, and they were kind of remaining within their shell. So saying, yeah, there is an empire governing us, but we're still the Greeks with our culture that is perfect. All the others are kind of barbarians, etc. We don't care. So I think in many ways the shift towards the east with Constantine and creation of refoundation of Constantinople, etc., it was a bit fundamentally re-injecting that mindset at an imperial scale, like saying we don't care now about the West. This was comforted by so many other reasons. If you look at Justinian reconquest in the 6th century, you see that, at that point, obviously, a Roman emperor had necessarily to reconquer Rome, because nobody in the Byzantine Empire has ever denied the importance of Rome. But first of all, they were trying to equate Constantinople to it. Secondly, it's not that the West by the 6th century was this great prey to reacquire. I mean, seriously, the Byzantines basically reconquered those areas that were the most Romanized, the ones where in fact they're that late antique political and social model that overlapped with the senatorial system, in fact, still functioned. That's the key. And then of course in the 7th century there is the main breakdown, there is the Arab invasions and so on, but up to that point, hitherto, the objective had been still reproducing that senatorial system all over the empire. And now I shifted once again the topic of the conversation, but what I meant is that the Byzantine mindset was born with this pretty clear attitude of remaining proud of itself, of stressing its own uniqueness, its own superiority. And they were kind of right, but you can argue that over the centuries, during the Middle Ages, this went lost at a point. Not because they weren't actually Roman or these other things, that obviously the empire was always the same. There is no discontinuity. But because they had kind of indulged into the belief of self superiority, of this acknowledgement that the Byzantines were at that point the greatest civilization. They were smart. They were superior to all these other barbarians around. But that's what basically crystallized also their same capability of assessing realistically what was going on. So that you can see that the ultimate decline of Constantinople and even its destruction at the hands of the Westerners with the Fourth Crusade is there is much debate on this. Don't believe it's a unique narrative here. It can be flipped in some ways, but definitely you can spot that the West was rocketing at the time because it was way more dynamic. It was not framed into this kind of sclerotic system that at that point was almost 1 millennium old, and that had to be just brought on without substantial changes. It's difficult now. I should have not started this because it's a very long thing. In fact, I quit it immediately once again because we will have to talk about this sooner or later. But these are the great the great debates of the Byzantinists make all the time. But they are important objectively because you may wonder, but how is that this system fundamentally, why it made it for 1 millennium, but at the same time, was it really this because I believe, and this is something I've hinted at also in some other videos, and also makes you understand what I really think about this, is that when you discover that there's been a Byzantine Empire that is really the Roman Empire, everybody kind of falls in love with it because it's a too fascinating topic not to say, okay, well, I must know this. And but sometimes people forget how it was born. I mean, people believe that there is a kind of a unique Roman Empire that throughout all its history was kind of the same. As if, I don't know, the Rome of Scipio was the same Rome of Caesar, same Rome of Caesar were the same of Hadrian. Well, we're talking about very, very different systems. And even when we talk about what the empire was culturally in its entirety, we forget the different things that let's say the different identities that the empire was ruling over. I mean, the empire, this is perhaps the most difficult thing to picture today, I believe. It's the most common miscomprehension. It wasn't a unique thing. It wasn't like a state. It wasn't like something that, was Roman. The moment you stepped into that, I don't know, across the Hadrian Wall, you were in a different world. It wasn't like that. The empire was effectively just a military presence. If we really want to concretize very, very, very strongly, the Romans had, of course, infrastructures and administration, very effective one. This military that controlled everything, but effectively the empire kind of went on by itself. I mean, the empire, meaning the communities that dwelled within the empire. And there were extremely significant differences between this. So looking at the eastern half of the Roman Empire, we can't just think about, that had been Romanized, right? The Romans had conquered places like Greece or Asia Minor or Egypt and Syria since, in fact, the first century, since the second century BC. Most of these regions had been conquered now effectively by the time of Augustus. So they had to be Roman, right? Well, no, because 300 years, 500 years even, is not much. Even in the same West, there were areas of Gaul or Spain or Britain that were, other areas that were, even into Italy, that were not fully kind of Romanized. And what do we mean by Romanized anyway? Because that being Roman, the greatness of being Roman at the time is that there was just a common faithfulness to the empire. Then you could speak all the languages that you want. You could have almost all the religions that you wanted. You could go dressed as you like. Nobody cared. This was the greatness of the empire. Kind of a very committed system that brought. There was kind of the sap that kept this thing cohesive. By the 4th century, this thing had consistently vanished. It's not because of Constantine that things went other ways. It's not because of Christianity. It's not because it's a sum of a huge amount of factors. It's a natural evolution. It's a natural transformation, let's say better, of a society, of a world, of a civilization that also went separate, went dilute. If you look at how the western half of the Roman Empire, there was no fall. There was not a single thing that it simply came apart by itself. So when looking even at the prosecution, let's say, of the empire in the East, you have to be aware of what there was there before, and why is that in the West things came. Finished. Why the East? What was there before that? And you realize that in fact there are many differences. That I'm not a fan of the division of saying the Byzantines were not true Romans, but there were big differences, and those have to be spotted because some persistencies of kind of a Latin Italic culture were exported even in the East. The East at this point still spoke Latin as the official language of the empire, of administration and so on, despite Greek was the most widespread language and commonly used. So there was actually a great a Roman legacy that stemmed from the origins, but at the same time there was a different mindset. And that is the trick. That is the great trick of history into which we fall all the time. So most of the time we think history in the way we want to picture it, with the values, with the games, with the dynamics we believe that existed. But if we had to go back there, we would be impressed by this. You have to think even by the 3rd century in the West, there were many Roman generals that we know it actually that had never heard of figures like Scipio or Cicero. Seriously, and therefore you say, but wait a minute, what is this then? That's why many people said, okay, we have to invent another name, we have to think about decadence and all this stuff, but without decadence, think just about the transformation, the natural transformation. and you can understand effectively so much about this world. All this for saying that the eastern half of the empire developed a certain character that also kind of started revolving around itself. I mean, it's even a kind of corporative idea. I mean, it's obvious that even the Western Senate was self-absorbed, and it was kind of out of touch with many realities that were out there. But still, the difference between West and East at this time is very much accentuated. And it kept being accentuated, so that these systems, aside from the fate of the empire itself, brought to very different consequences into these areas of Europe and the Mediterranean that have to be known, have to be understood. Especially in medieval history, that is the direct consequence of these. It's we also in here we think at a certain point the Western Roman Empire fell, the Middle Ages start. Everybody had forgotten everything in terms of no, paradoxically not. For instance, the empire was not forgotten at all. So yeah, they may not remember who Caesar or Scipio were. I mean, among the average person, but still, the empire was still there. Romanity, let's say, was still there. There were many other concepts. Now there was definitely also Christianity that kind of developed other concepts, other visions, but nevertheless, that's still part of the equation. And they were blended together. So that's why I stress so much also to recover the Western let's say the Western justification or motivation, at least, for the Renovatio Imperii, because even though the Eastern Roman Empire had withdrawn from a certain world and was reasoning now on its own basis that were different from other people that had not forgotten, however, what the Roman Empire had been, and had its own vision of the same. So I know that among you it's plenty of Byzantine history lovers, just like me, by the way. But I know that also holding certain favoritisms by saying, oh well, everything was Byzantine was fine, the rest of the world was kind of crap. It's not really productive, and it's not really what even a true Byzantinist, I think, would think like, because if you don't understand the relations between Constantinople and the rest of the world, you can't, and if you don't motivate the reasons, the choices that made the empire move into that direction, you can't effectively understand. You would fall in the same mistake that eventually brought the empire to an end, or at least that didn't make it cope with what the surrounding world was, after many centuries, of course, but still starting from those bases that had remained kind of immutable and unchanged at the core level. Well, these beliefs, these structures, were something new by the 4th century, in good part. So they weren't quite as the same thing. That's why it's important also to study very much the foundational phase of Constantinople, because in its kind of empire, if we want to put it in these terms, because we have started the video by saying, okay, it didn't change much after all in those very years. Yes, but at the same time it was something built out relatively out of scratch, and this therefore was given a certain character that was much more independent from its origins than what had ever been conceived within the empire. And it's a really interesting topic. I don't know, we'll have to talk endlessly about this again. So, going back to this senatorial system as it was created by Constantine, let's say that it was also in this sense a consequence of the newest considerations that had emerged into those worlds. I mean, in many ways, this new foundation was given, as it often happens, the most updated character, right? So this new symbiosis between the senators and bureaucracy basically satisfied at the same time, in a safe way, in a very quick and efficient way, the problems that had been posed during the early Roman Empire. Because during the early Roman Empire, senators and bureaucrats didn't like each other at all, because they were from two different classes, from two different orders, and that was the most important part of the story. That's why, in many ways, there was the collapse even of the Principate during the 3rd century, because the balance over which Augustus had built fundamentally the institutional profile of Rome, of the empire, had come apart. I mean, the middle classes didn't exist anymore. Augustus had the intelligence not to, to balance everything up. In a certain sense, it also left much still to do in the future to his descendants, because to his he didn't actually have the descendants, but to his how you call them, the follower, the successors, and this equilibrium had brought to some attrition even between the emperor and the Senate, and the bureaucracy that also now an empire like Rome hadn't ever been before the late empire, something extremely developed. But still, there were this kind of bureaucrats that were kind of aware of their different condition, that definitely sided more preferably with the emperor than with the Senate, because definitely the main aim now was to side with who was gaining usually the most powerful, the upper hand. But the same problem, there is the crisis of their own classes. This is also important for the East, because in the East, the middle classes had remained stronger on average. I mean, it's not... also, the Hellenistic world was actually much more stratified than the Western one before, but it was still kind of very rich. So with trade, with all this craftsmen, etc., kind of remained more economically vivacious. So there was kind of a middle class at all times up to the big crack of the 6th century. In that, and even beyond, because even putting these, sharp divisions is not useful. That was useful for bureaucracy, because they were kind of, they were reasonably hungry, but they still were enough well off to have an education, to study. There were schools. The new bureaucracy of Constantinople brought new chances of employment, and brought these people, in fact, to enter consistently into the administration for their merits. This in the West was growing kind of complicated, because the socio-economical picture was kind of very, very different, or tendentially, and they also lacked kind of human resources in a way. So, incidentally, the areas of the empire that were eventually not to be reincorporated, even in projects like Justinian's reconquest, etc., were the ones where these resources had already ran out, where it was not convenient anymore to push for this, because effectively the Roman Empire had expanded, even geographically, only into those places where there was a chance to Romanize, and Romanize fundamentally equated to, not to extend citizenship. I mean, that was a consequence. The Romanization initially passed through economy. It was a matter of buying Roman goods, making the local economy dependent on the Roman Empire, market. And that was very important. That's why places like Caledonia or Germany were effectively were not conquered at the end, not because the Romans actually lacked the potential to conquer those lands. It's ridiculous. Germany was conquered for 20 years. Caledonia obviously didn't have any, it wasn't a threat in this sense, but it's simply that it was useless for the Romans to Romanize these guys, because they didn't accept the models of Romans lifestyle and civilization. They didn't give a damn. They didn't have the local resources to integrate their systems into the Roman one. They didn't have interest in that sense. So now it was partly happening in the West at the same level. Within lands that had been under Roman rule for even half of a millennium, and then eventually now were not. It turned out that they hadn't been so Romanized, and if you follow that geographically, you realize, in fact, it were the most depressed areas where Roman influence had been weaker. Another proof that the Roman Empire was actually not so pervasive nor so actually a devastating entity, like sucking all the resources dry. Of course, the civil wars had done this, especially during the 3rd century, also the raids, etc. But there were also other problems. The idea is that the Romans just cared about not having problems in terms of revolts, as long as trade functioned. In fact, that was their main goal. As long as trade worked, as you could collect taxes, that was fine. So there was no need to massacre entire populations. There was no effective, unless you don't want to show off, maybe in a situation where things were getting worse. Yeah, this happened. The Romans were terribly brutal, but that's what, in fact, every kind of empire has done, historically speaking, without too many problems. But there is no extra need for extra violence or massacres, that, especially at this time, where not even enemies were massacred anymore, but they were actually settled somewhere, because there was a consistent need of manpower, and slaughtering someone, a community meant not to have the resources to repopulate that area for not even for generations, but actually for centuries at this point. So the Constantinopolitan symbiosis finally satisfied those high bureaucrats that had always looked for, entering into this heaven of the senatorial world of the aristocrats. So they kept them committed. In a moment where, in fact, the wars of expansion had ceased, there was kind of no one to truly Romanize, if not internally. I mean, especially those barbarians who were integrated into the empire. But now the competition stood within the social orders that were more profitable to put into competition, at least the ones who had those capabilities still alive. And because belonging to the senatorial order equated definitely to have this hereditary title. So it wasn't just about you, it was just entering the club. Before, it was just the citizenship. That for tribesmen was definitely, wow, Roman citizenship, I can enter this world, go have a farm, things like that. And now everybody kind of had a citizenship, which consistently didn't serve to anything anymore. The best thing was getting to the upper echelons, making the big shot, because all the other people were kind of poor. So that was the main ambition. And therefore, at that point, you could also not just have a farm like back in the day, but having a whole estate and ruling over other people. And obviously, I'm making it brutal. It's not really like this. I mean, this process kind of happened very gradually, but it was being part of a nobility, so that your children, your family, was part of this elite of the ruling class of the greatest empire, of the only empire, the universal empire, the Christian empire, the Roman Empire, in short. And so you can look at this system created, started by Constantine, then perfection, obviously over time. In fact, in turn, in itself, the perfectioning of several centuries of experience that came from several worlds combined. This was still the greatness of the empire, still what the sap of the empire was all about. I mean, drawing the best from the best. So it was a model derived from the Greek Eastern / Roman Italic and also / Roman Hellenistic at this point traditions, and the whole thing was based on the political calculation and political balance. In a way, it also stiffened the aristocratic system. It made it kind of more isolated from all the rest of society, even though it was directly involved into it at the same time, but just like a ruler fundamentally. And this, in fact, served to plan more easily the orientation of the empire. And this actually stemmed from a great trauma that we haven't put much emphasis on now, but it's very important to explain. That is, in fact, what the empire had gone through in the previous centuries, especially in the terrible 3rd century, where the empire had gone literally disgregating, and not much because of the offensives from the barbarian world, but also from within the same Roman world. This fact of keeping the senatorial and bureaucratic elites all together in a unique body that also now was fundamentally revolving chiefly around the same Senate in Constantinople, so you even had a physical location that made it identifiable, kind of close together, in spite of the scattered properties all around the empire. But even, if you take, this was mostly a Mediterranean empire, right? In the past, it had not been like that, because the empire fundamentally was also larger. So here we're talking about the Eastern Empire. It's something more compact. It's relatively, in the Eastern Mediterranean, distances are not so great, because in the Mediterranean in general, they are not great. But there weren't actually in the empire this greater chunks of land that could be do a bit on their own. Like in the West, Gaul, for instance, had acquired a huge importance on its own. It had become actually more important than Italy in itself. And there are this big, like, take the Iberian Peninsula, take even Africa with its etc. Well, maybe Africa, it wasn't much in this sense, but that was more composite. And during the 3rd century, effectively, there had been senators that had started going their own way, even taking up their arms and think about, this mostly happened from generals that started to usurp and to rule from certain areas. Think about the empire of Gauls that was formed by the local Roman administration with Tetricus, etc., that put an end to Aurelianus. Well, at that point, the empire that was a kind of a thing on its own. At that time, there was the Palmyrene Empire that had conquered large areas of the Near East, etc. That was kind of lost to Rome, even reaching Egypt, etc. And you had this big empire of the Gauls that was also very important from a military point of view. Then there had the rest of the empire more. That was like 3 chunks. Aurelian put an end to that, but that could be consistently the end of the empire. And interestingly enough, the empire of the Gauls had never posed itself in a kind of a competitive relation with the empire. We simply wanted to say, okay, there is an empire in the Gauls and there is an empire somewhere else in Italy or wherever you rule from. And so that had been terrible, because the same Senate, the same emperors, the same leaders that had tried to put that together had realized that that original system where the senators had their own estates outside, etc., now couldn't work like the kind of the emperors were, the senators were scattered all over this huge Mediterranean and European world, couldn't be kept together with the same means. You couldn't effectively decentralize so much. That was a compromise that Augustus was forced, because there was no other way to do it at the time, to accept this large empire that at the time was kind of florid, kind of without enemies, or at least enemies of any consistence, of aggressiveness, to share, to give to the emperors their estates in this rich, most Romanized provinces, and let them do it on their own, and controlling instead in the imperial provinces the frontiers, the military, stuff like that. Now it had become impossible, especially with the barbarian invasions, with internal strifes between the same. The system had become to collapse, because now also the routing into the single estate was kind of a way to dominate the empire from. That's why also the system had kind of collapsed, because before, having land somewhere did it in another province where you maybe even went living didn't mean to have a kind of an empire there on your own. Yes, it was kind of having a very large estate, still directing Roman politics through those assets, but it wasn't a way to decompose the empire. I mean, the empire was sticking together exactly because of the Mediterranean markets could put all these assets in motion, and to profit from it with the great intercontinental trades with China, with etc. Now this had collapsed, so everybody kind of stuck to their own domain and started kind of fighting from there, because now trade was starting to decline. So the main thing is having your resources where you to control your resources directly from where you produce them. So that's why decentralization had been important. It's not surprising that at this time the Romans start bringing their armories, for instance, all back from the frontiers or wherever. Actually, they quite didn't exist as such. It was usually the Roman legions that had their own foundries, or they were connected with other cities. But now there are state-owned foundries that are close to the core of the empire, in the big cities of the walled cities of the Mediterranean, and they're effectively controlled by the state, jealously, with a kind of a military discipline, because everything was collapsing. So even there is this need of concentrating only one physical place, and that's why Constantinople also had this kind of greater importance, because Rome, back in the day, was really the center of the empire. But at the same time, the goal of the Romans was to make Rome everywhere. I mean, to remake Rome in everywhere. In fact, the Roman cities were exactly this, a copy in smaller scale of Rome that had to be expanded. Now the empire was going the other way around. So Constantinople is a copy of Rome, but a competitive one from this territorial location, where everything has to be concentrated in. Constantinople was never liked by the same thing, by the Syrians, by the Palestinians, by the Egyptians. It was Constantinople, and it came to rule, in fact, especially during Middle Ages, as literally as the only city of the empire. Like the only city of the empire, was the other one, it became Thessalonica. It was in fact kind of trying to sneak out. In some ways, they didn't like the Constantinopolitans at all themselves. But for the rest, the empire, by the times of, the Komnenians, for instance, was effectively a large private estates of the families of Constantinople. I know Rome had been kind of the same thing originally, but at least in there was an extension, a geographical extension of the not just of the estates, because there was a conquest, a colonization, a Romanization, but also the integration of external elements. At this time it wasn't. It was a contraction within itself. At that time it worked, but it also brought two problems, naturally, because if you look at and here geography played a role, because aside from the obvious position of Constantinople on the Bosphorus, that is such an incredibly strategical point between the Black and the Aegean seas, and and this location is just perfect, like a peninsula with this the Golden Horn even re-entering inside. It was fantastic, and surprisingly enough, Byzantium before Constantine hadn't been kind of a enormously important city in the past. It was one of the was a Greek Thracian colony, but it had been founded there, but it hadn't developed that much. But if you look at geographically all around, you have the Balkans that were actually not very populated at the time. They had been depopulating fast. The Balkans actually were very much agricultural. The western half of the Roman Empire was much more connected, even in terms of the hinterland, with the sea than the Balkans proper. It was mostly the Greek area that was not just in Greece proper, but also and therefore in the Peloponnese, but also in the Asia Minor, western coast. Kind of was more dynamic. So that could be reached by sea, because they were mostly coastal centers. Like the Western Anatolia was one of the most heavily intense Romanized province of the empire, because it was actually an Hellenic area. So it was Romanized, so they spoke Greek, of course, but there was this enormous concentration of cities into this coastal area that could be dominated from the sea. That's also why the Byzantine navy was so important. It was rebuilt after, as a necessary strategical tool to control this Eastern Mediterranean. So was fundamentally Syria and Palestine and Egypt, because Syria, Palestine, and Egypt are consistently, arid, even though they're kind of fertile on their own. Actually, Syria is, also geography changed over the years. Even environment change. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were actually some of the most fertile areas of the empire, especially Egypt, as you understand. But the majority of the centers were concentrated on the coasts, right? Or on the Nile, in that case, of Egypt. And on the back you have the desert. So basically it's not like Gaul or Spain, that you have, also have this kind of Mediterranean area that that is way more interconnected with the empire. But you have overall the continental dimension that is also flourishing. I mean, even in northern Gaul, there wasn't so heavily Romanized, but at least, there was a very strong, amount of a net of cities, and even a discrete agricultural production. So it was a very different world. It was a very much more maritime based than West. So also in here, the choice of Constantinople was geographical in many ways, because if you had a strong navy, you could control places like Alexandria, all the Asia Minor coast, that is the one you have. Jerusalem and Antioch are very close to the sea. You can't reach them easily. So that's how you also make this broader consideration, because just imagine that, shifting armies by sea is dramatically quick. By especially, there were in a couple of days you could go everywhere with an expedition. Naturally, of course, it was difficult to mount up an expedition. The difficulties with others, but the range of action from Constantinople was pretty high over these provinces and their centers, their main their main productive centers. So this was a very special location for creating an empire from. So these are all factors that contributed to mold what we call the Byzantine culture, civilization, and that played an enormous role in defining, in fact, world history, but in a sense to also transform the same society over time towards certain directions. And the Senate, at this point, had acquired a much stronger Constantinopolitan character, also because of these advantages that the same location of Constantinople entailed. You could concentrate there, the center of power, keeping the senators close, knowing what they were up to, kind of making them participate to your political action to control them better. And this is kind of in many phases in history. Think about the Sun King Louis XIV. It was kind of a very effective political strategy, because it brought you to control closely an environment that is very much intertwined, and it works on behalf of your authority, because you give them essentially the chance to participate to the government. And okay, well, today's video is longer than I expected, but it's still, I hope it was kind of meaningful. So we will definitely come back on the topic sometime soon. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.